Good morning, everyone. We are going to start shortly. I'm sure we're still getting some participants coming in. My name is Sahar Safai, Sage on Earth Consulting founder. It's my absolute honor to host and moderate today's session on socioeconomic equity in all hazards approach to disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. The event has been specially designed, sensitive to the unprecedented situation and experiences we are living through with the pandemic, its impacts, and widespread social awareness and protest to the systemic racial, class, gender, sexuality-based inequalities in the society. Our distinguished panelists in this session will help us better understand the challenges, opportunities, vulnerabilities of different groups, and how disaster have disproportionate impacts on different classes of the society. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I live, work, play, and learn is an unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, including the territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I also want to take a second to acknowledge the suffering of the people of Lebanon, especially the residents of Beirut, from the catastrophic explosion that happened 2 days ago, and wishing them strength for the long path of recovery ahead of them in this very difficult situation. Before we start, I do have some Zoom logistics. We are using webinar format of Zoom, which means you can see the panelists, all of them all at once, as we have a very dynamic back and forth and discussion format going on, but you will not be able to see the participants. There are two boxes that you need to use. One is the chat, and this is at the lower bottom side of your sheet. And the chat, which we encourage you to put your reactions, comments to the panelists, but it's better to choose the option in the chat box for comments to go to both participants and the panelists. Talk to each other, put inputs, show your love and encouragement to our amazing panelists. But the questions should go to the Q&A box. This is very important because when we have the Q&A, which we have two of them, one in the middle of the session and another at the end, I will only look at the Q&A box. So there you can put your question, you can start with the name of the panelist that you believe you want them to answer and address the question. And then you can also vote thumbs up to the questions that you like. If your question has already been addressed or there is a question that you really like, you can thumbs it up. So when the QA time comes, I start from the top of the list because those are the questions that most of you would like to be addressed. And you're all on mute. We will only hear from you. I will unmute you towards the end when we would like to say thank you to our panelists and say our goodbyes. So welcome to the first webinar of 2020 Understanding Risk Symposium. This year's symposium is hosted by Natural Resources Canada and made possible with efforts of many people who are organizing and convening many of the sessions, but especially a core team that has been organizing, and you probably have been receiving many emails from them related to various sessions. This is the third Understanding Risk Symposium, building on 2017 and 2018 events, and are meant to create a space for planners, engineers, scientists, researchers, policymakers, and decision makers, students and residents and citizens to come together, connect, get inspired, collaborate to better understand disaster and climate risk, to enhance resilience and plan for better recovery. This is an offshoot of an international event of a similar name, Understanding Risk, which happens biannually in World Bank, hosted by the World Bank. I've been to all 5 of them and one of the URBCs before, and I love them because of the energy that exists. And they are beautiful because of the people, not only the panelists and organizers, but also the participants. It's normally a big party, and I think of them as events that I go to see old friends, make new friends, and get inspired by my brilliant colleagues. we can't have the in-person event this year. You're not even in the same room. It feels odd for me sitting here alone, but we have the privilege of having an amazing set of panelists for this session and future ones also, who I am sure with their energy, passion, especially about this very sensitive topic, we are going to connect, get inspired, and get energized from this session. So for any further ado, I will start introducing the panelists. Today we do have the honor of having the Parliamentary Secretary for Gender Equity, Ms. Mitzi Dean, opening the session for us. She was elected as MLA for Esquimalt Metrocin in 2017 and was appointed the Parliamentary Secretary for Gender Equity in February 2018. She grew up in Southeast England and has spent the last 30 years helping vulnerable groups, vulnerable people in various roles in BC and in UK and BC, including most recently serving as Executive Director of the Pacific Centre Family Services Association. We have Robin Cox. She's the program head of the graduate program in climate action leadership at Royal Roads University and a professor in the Disaster and Emergency Management Master of Arts program. As the director of the Resilience by Design Lab, Robin leads multiple action research and educational initiatives focused on resilience and enhancing the capacity of youth and adults to address the complex and intersecting challenges of climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction. Jackie Yip, she is a research scientist within the Public Safety Geoscience program at Natural Resources Canada, where she's leading research efforts in developing best practices and new methods for understanding flood risk and community resilience and recovery. Her research interest lies at the intersection of climate adaptation, disaster risk modeling, decision-making, and specializes in predictive modeling and data visualization. We have Emily Hicken. She has worked as a practitioner in the field of emergency management since 2006, spending the first 12 years of her career with the province of BC, working in health emergency management, and then for Emergency Management BC, where she held the role of Director of First Nation Coordination. Emily is now the Director of Emergency Management at First Nations Health Authority, and beyond her work, she pursues academic interests with a central focus on understanding colonialism as an unnatural and enduring disaster impacting Indigenous communities. Last but not least, we have Laurie Johnson. She's an internationally recognized urban planner specializing in disaster recovery and catastrophic risk management. She's based in San Francisco, and for the past more than 30 years, she has combined her unique blend of professional practice and research to help communities address the complex urban challenges posed by natural hazards and disasters. Much of her post-disaster recovery efforts are captured in her recent book, After Great Disasters, an in-depth analysis of how 6 countries managed community recovery, published in 2017. She's the president of Earthquake Engineering Research Institute and on the board of directors of the Earthquake and Megacities Initiatives and advisory board of the Global Earthquake Model. So I would like to now pass the floor to Parliamentary Secretary of Gender Equality, Mr. Dean. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Nasne Mitzi Dean. I'm very honoured to join you on Lekwungen and Saxon land today. My name is Mitzi Dean and I'm the Parliamentary Secretary for Gender Equity. I go by she, her pronouns, and I spoke in Lekwungen language to show my appreciation and respect for these lands and the Indigenous people whose traditional territory this is, and to acknowledge that I'm a visitor and I just feel so humbled and privileged to be able to work here. March 2020 marked one of the most challenging situations any of us have ever faced. In just a few short months, COVID-19 changed the world as we knew it for the long term. And for those who are already systematically disadvantaged, the impacts of COVID-19 have made life even more difficult. Just last week, the YWCA Canada and the University of Toronto released a report that looked at the COVID-19 pandemic and what a recovery could look like. And if we recognise that an emergency situation impacts people in different ways, one of the authors was quoted as saying, quote, "COVID-19 has not been the great equalizer. It's been the great revealer of existing inequalities." And that's what I would like to focus on today. And this is why our small and mighty gender equity team applied a gender-based analysis plus lens to all stages of the pandemic and our recovery. Because factors such as age, gender, race and ethnicity, health status, geographic location, socioeconomic status, all play a role in how people experience an emergency and a disaster. Youth unemployment is now at a staggering 29%. And women are one of the groups at risk of long-term economic insecurity as a result of the pandemic, because many work part-time and in jobs that have been most affected, like hospitality, retail, food services, personal care. And within these sectors, it's immigrant, marginalised and racialised women who are most impacted. And women are also most likely to be in a caregiving role for children or elderly parents, and of course, sometimes both. It's also mostly women who work in the sex trade, which has become more dangerous and precarious than even before the pandemic. And we've actually held some roundtable meetings with sex workers and with service providers about this issue specifically. Tragically, we've heard concerns from many social agencies that the risk of domestic, gender-based and sexual violence has also increased during the pandemic. And in a world where women in particular are isolated at home, what happens when home is a place of violence, intimidation, threats and fear? It is mostly women and children and non-binary people who are at risk. And again, for Indigenous and racialised women and girls, those with disabilities, the incidence and risks of violence are even greater. And these are our friends, our neighbours, people that we see in the grocery store, faces in a crowd. They're part of our families and our communities, and they must be part of our work to recover from this pandemic. The YWCA Canada report says it well. There is no recovery if we leave women, two-spirit and gender diverse people behind. The old normal was simply not good for everyone. And some economists are calling the pandemic a she-cession because women have been hit the hardest on all fronts. We know there was already a gender pay gap that existed, with women in BC making on average more than 20% less than men. This is exacerbated when you apply an intersectional lens. And we also know that one of the best supports we can offer to ensure women have better access to good paying jobs is childcare. When women are supported, children, families and communities benefit. Helping families access quality, affordable and inclusive care means parents aren't forced to choose between their career and family. Investments in childcare give parents and especially women the opportunity to fully participate in the workplace and take a role in getting BC's economy back on track. So I'm really proud of the work that our government has done to fund more spaces. We're investing more than $2 billion in the Childcare BC plan to help families access affordable quality childcare. And as of July, BC has funded nearly 16,800 new licensed childcare spaces, which is the fastest creation of spaces in BC's history. And at the heart of each of one of these spaces is a child and a family. And they're the future of our communities, and they deserve our support. Personally, having worked in the social sector for over 30 years, I've heard too many stories from women about the horrors that can happen at home as a result of violence, and that increases in times of crisis and disaster. With people forced to self-isolate due to COVID, they often find themselves trapped with someone who's violent and not being able to call out for help. So we work really hard with numerous partners to ensure additional emergency spaces are available for people facing violence. We've also recently provided $10 million to the Ending Violence Association of BC for emergency sexual response services, because sexual assault and domestic violence strike at the heart of someone's safety and their well-being and can cause lifelong trauma if there's no access to the supports that are needed to heal. BC was fortunate to come into the COVID-19 pandemic from a place of economic strength. And because of our strength, we were able to take immediate action to help people, businesses, and communities. We've included financial supports for people whose ability to work has been affected, supports for vulnerable people who are already homeless or are at risk of homelessness, help for post-secondary students, And supports have been put in place to ensure families, immigrant communities, young people, and those who are the most vulnerable and impacted have a helping hand in the months and years ahead. This COVID-19 pandemic has been a huge blow to so many, and especially women, who are overrepresented in many of the sectors hardest hit by the pandemic. And frankly, the job losses have been staggering, and we have a long road ahead to recover. And while we expect to see many people returning to work as more businesses reopen and regain their footing, it's vital that all people, especially those who already face disadvantages, are supported and given the best possible opportunity to move forward as we go forward in our recovery. Ultimately, there is no recovery if we leave behind those who are already marginalised. Hicken.
Thank you so much for these great points. We are very grateful for your time. Totally understand that you're very busy, and we realize your time are booked every half an hour, and you will soon go back to the daily business of the legislative added by COVID issues. Thank you for your time. So now we move to our panelists. As you have realized, we have a powerhouse of all women panelists. This was not intentional. We did have some potential men to join us, but their schedule didn't work. But it is an honor to have this all-women panel for this session. So I've been talking to the panelists past few weeks. Amazing opportunity, have been a great learning experience. In the conversation, have heard a lot of their personal stories. So we would like to start with that. We'd like to start with Emily and Robin to share their personal story of how they got into this specific aspect of disaster risk management. Emily, please go ahead.
Perfect. Thanks, Sahar. And thank you so much for having me on the panel today. Today, I'm joining this panel from the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish Nation and Littlewat Nation here in Whistler, BC. And so thankful to be able to live in this space and conduct my work from the comfort and space and privilege of my home on the territories throughout this COVID experience. From a personal perspective, I come from the Little Red River Cree Nation on my father's side, and on my mother's side, I'm of British descent. And it took me a while to find my space and place in the field of practice of emergency management. I started out, like many young people do, learning about disasters from a very academic experience, and it took me a while to carve out what that practical experience looked like on the ground. And slowly I found my way in a position with the BC Public Service working for the Ministry of Health. And I would say finding myself in the field of practice didn't really start until a year or two into my professional practice, where I was part of a response that took place in Kinkham Inlet. And it was part of a response that occurred in the mid-fall from a Pineapple Express storm, so a really heavy onset rainstorm with a king tide event. And what had happened was the community of Kinkham had experienced really horrific flooding. And as I responded to the event as the on-call duty officer from the Ministry of Health, I was really just responding from my place of professional practice. But after the event, it actually came full circle for me from a personal space. I, on the personal side, played on an Indigenous women's soccer team, and many of my teammates were actually from kind of nations within the Central Island, many from Guilford Island, Kinkham, and Alert Bay. And hearing their experience of their family's experience through that flooding event actually really changed my perspective of seeing what the inequitable space and how that inequity was simmering up for the community. And it really came to a head for me from one of my girlfriends who called me in deep despair, and she said, you know, the reason why my family's in this space and place isn't out of choice. It's really out of this imposed space of legislation and requirement of how reserves are established under the Indian Act. And it really led me into some deep spaces of thinking and conversation, not just with her, but her family and the community as a whole. And what I started to see was that there was an interface here between how the increased and intensity of natural disasters were impacting communities all around British Columbia in terms of the frequency and the intensity of events from the space of climate change, but also from the spaces of other environmental impacts, such as the community has experienced deep spaces of deforestation, which had essentially changed the way that the river flowed through their community, and all of these other perturbations to the natural landscape. But what the biggest shift for me in this work was hearing from Marianne about how her community would have never have wintered in this community. It was essentially their summer community where the community would go. It was their fishing ground. It was their traditional territory where they would summer. And then in the winter, they would move into another geographic space within their territory because they simply knew that this space was at risk to really significant frequent flooding events. And as a result, through the Indian Act and through kind of this legislated space of how reserves are set up and established, the community was essentially required to live full-time in this small geographic location, which was highly at risk. And so it made me really start to understand how, as a space of government, we actually create these imposed spaces of risk through our own spaces of legislation. And there were actually these beautiful spaces of inherent resilience that Indigenous communities all along the coast and all through BC utilized in terms of kind of navigating and managing risk and these spaces of resilience. And it was through this learning that I tried to share this with my colleagues across my field of practice, actually through the debrief that we had for this event. And instead of kind of meeting it with the same space of curiosity and understanding of why the community would feel such despair around this event, it was really met with a deep space of resistance from the colleagues that I was interfacing with. And people couldn't really seem to reconcile in my conversations that I was having why there would be why it wasn't just about the seasonality of flooding and the impacts to the community, but why it was about a much deeper space of knowledge, reciprocity, and of acknowledging and understanding what resilience really looks like in communities. And as a result, I really struggled to actually move through this event as a practitioner. It left me with really deep feelings of guilt and left me with just such a profound space of loss and not really being able to see myself or find myself within my field of practice on a personal front, even though I was feeling deeply grounded on the professional front. And I really hold my hands up to my employers at the BC government, at the Ministry of Health, and the leadership that I had there that encouraged me not to pack it in and not to feel that sense of despair, but to kind of move forward with that. And as a result, I was encouraged to jump into a PhD, and Robin Cox had been along with me for part of that ride, and just to find my voice and find that place of understanding what it means to understand Indigenous resilience and Indigenous resilience in this place of risk. And to find how to share the story and how to do it in a way that honors Indigenous voices and people throughout this experience. So hopefully over the next few hours together, I'll be able to share a bit more. And I guess I'll turn it over to Robin and back to Sahar right now.
Okay, thank you, Robin.
Hi, thanks so much, Sahar, for having me as part of this panel. Very honored to be one amongst many amazing women. And yes, I also want to acknowledge, I also live, as Mitzi indicated, where she lives and works in on the land of the Algonquin and Kosamson people. And I want to acknowledge that Royal Roads also sits on those territories. and stands on the Songhees and the Esquimalt and WSÁNEĆ people's historical lands and the lands that they still have connection and relationships with. I'll try and be brief about how I came to this sort of dimension of disasters. I am a psychologist by training, and when I had my master's degree, I worked with the practice with a focus on stress and coping, really. And most of my work was with street engaged youth, and then in the downtown east side with women and LGBTQI people who were marginalized by many things, including violence in relationships. And while I was there, my detective partner introduced me to disaster work. And so I brought that lens to disaster work. It was a lens really that I grew up with. I grew up with two very strong women in a family that was shaped early on by domestic violence. And I think I grew up with that analysis that Mitzi referred to, that sort of gendered analysis, and that just grew and was sharpened with my work in disasters. In my responses, I worked as a psychosocial responder as a volunteer primarily in many disasters in Canada and in 9/11. And every time I engaged with survivors, and when I started doing research in that area, that lens of the differential impact, the differential access to resources, the differential access to having a voice in shaping processes, recovery and otherwise, was always very apparent and very much shaping my analysis of risk, but also my analysis of what needed to happen in order to really move towards resilience. I work now, as my introduction indicated, at Royal Roads, and in the Resilience by Design Lab, the work that we do there is very much focused on understanding and trying to contribute to resilience with young people, many of whom have been marginalized by their age and by other dimensions of who they are in the world, including geography and identity, etc. And with professionals who are working to try to increase our capacity to adapt to all the many challenges we face, and those include obviously climate change and the huge increase in risk from natural hazard related events, obviously now in the context of COVID. So this lens really has been part of who I am from the start, and it's shaped my work in this field of disaster and emergency management and climate action. Thanks. Turn it back to you, Sahar.
Wonderful. Great start. Thank you so much. Continuing with Robin and Emily, obviously the COVID and the impact that we have been witnessing has made it very clear, once again, the disproportionate impact of disasters. Last week, there was the data news coming out of Toronto that showed this disproportionate impact on the people of color, Black and colored people. So I would like to ask you and Robin to start with sharing some of your thoughts from the experiences and lessons learned from the COVID.
You have my PowerPoint. Yes. I don't use PowerPoint a lot, but I wanted to use it for this just to sort of swing through. If you can change it to slideshow mode, that'd be awesome. So really, this has been a real focus of mine during COVID, is to really understand not only the challenges and how we are managing this particular crisis, but how it can inform what we do moving forward with disasters and with climate change, the largest really healthcare and other disasters looming here and looming ahead. And this idea that, and it can be used somewhat tritely, but this idea that crisis really refers to both the suffering and the opportunity, and this idea that a crisis is a turning point in a disease. And I think that's very applicable in the context of what we're talking about, if we unpack that word disease. And it, you know, there's a choice point about how we recover, what we pull forward and what we let go. And it's already been said, so I'm not going to spend much time on that, but the way that disasters really illuminate these gaps and the pre-existing patterns of risk and vulnerability and inequity that exist in our society. This notion that plagues drive change, yes, plagues, this is a sort of thing that's been floating around on the web. Plagues do drive change, and obviously we've experienced many changes. But it's only with our intentionality and real persistence about carrying forward this lens, this gender analysis, this intersectionality analysis, that we're going to be making changes that we want, pushing us towards a world that is just a world that we want to live in. So I look at disasters and I look at COVID a lot from the lens of not only what are the symptoms of this disease, figuratively and metaphorically, but also what are the underlying causes? Next slide. So in looking at that, I've often talked about disasters sort of create this pause in normal, and obviously with COVID, that's an extended pause. We don't know how long it's going to last. And it is not only a pause, but it's a transformation in what we understand as normal. Because it's an invisible risk, that can make these changes harder because we are responding to an unknown. We are responding to something that we can't see, and that often exacerbates the uncertainty. And it often makes people, although we've seen lots of demonstration of a willingness to change, it can often make people really cling on to what they held before, what they knew before. And because we don't know what the outcomes of this are, and because we don't know all the impacts, and they are, I think, we talk about being in recovery, but I think we're in a recovery while we're still in a response, and that's going to carry on. We don't know for how long. Teresa Tam obviously yesterday spoke of it lasting for years. Next slide. So what are some of the lessons, and these are only some. I would say, if nothing else, COVID has demonstrated quite clearly, in the same way that other disasters like Katrina have demonstrated, that current systems are not working, or as some would argue, and I would support this, that they're working exactly as they're supposed to, that we live in a system of capitalism that actually requires inequity to function. We understand that the transformations that we must make have to be just. They have to address these inequities, that inequality doesn't support not only the resilience of those who are marginalized, but for any of us, for any of society, and that we have to work together. An often used phrase, but we have to work together. We have to cooperate and collaborate if we're going to make the changes that we need to make in order to work towards resilience. Next slide. Some of the other changes are around lessons are around understanding risk and the importance of communication. We've adopted science, and we've demonstrated that people will actually listen to science when it's presented, and it's informed by an understanding that our response to risk is not intellectual as much as it is emotional, and that we have to understand how to communicate risk in ways that address that emotional component. We have to work with media who shape and focus our attention, our short attention spans, and shape the message. And we've seen that with COVID, which was treated as an emergency, which is framed as an emergency and has required people to respond as an emergency. We don't see that so much with climate change, and that needs to change if we're going to manage that in any way that allows us to be resilient. Next slide. Prevention's worth a pound of cure. We're a very reactive society. We've seen that with COVID. There were things that we did following SARS and the H1N1 flu pandemic, but we didn't do enough, and we didn't carry enough of those lessons forward to really anticipate. And we knew that these kinds of pandemics were coming, and we know that when we don't do that, the costs are absolutely exacerbated. And that's true of COVID, and it's true of climate change, that the longer we wait, the more it's going to cost us, both in terms of human suffering and financial costs. Next slide. So this is just, reducing risk requires decisive, courageous action. It's too hard to read this slide, really, but that this will not, the measures that we have taken are making some difference in disaster risk reduction, but they're nowhere near as courageous and bold as we need in order to reduce the residual risk that is escalating just as rapidly as the curve of COVID transmission was rising during the early days of the pandemic. Next slide. that we need these radical behavioral changes. We understand, I think this has demonstrated to everyone how interconnected everything is, and that we need to work beyond silos, whether those are governmental, sector specific, or between us as individuals, that the changes that we need to make may look disproportionate in the face of an invisible risk and in the face of an invisible threat like COVID or like climate change. It's not invisible to many people, but it is invisible to many people in the south of Canada. And that resilience requires flexibility, an adaptive mindset, reflection, courage, and an openness to change. Next slide. I'm going to wrap it up here. We know the roadmap. We have guidance documents. These are some of them. There are others. We need to start living these and really in integrating them into the work that we do in every aspect if we're going to make the changes that we need to make. And the final slide, which is just a quote by Joanna Macy. If the world is to be healed by human efforts, I'm convinced it will be by ordinary people, people whose love of this life is even greater than their fear, people who can open up to the web of life that is calling us into being. And I think that's the invitation for all of us, whether we're working in this field, whether we're citizens, that we have to all join in this work together. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the great points and the great inspirational quote. So next we'd like to shift slightly from COVID and try to open the span of our attention to all types of disasters. Laurie, you have been for many years, decades, have worked on seeing the impacts of different types of disasters and the recovery process. Could you share some of the experiences, insights, and evidence of disproportionate impacts on different groups by different types of hazards?
Sure, thanks, Sahar. For me as an urban planner, I came into this field, especially with a background in geoscience, really interested in, or focused, I guess I would say, on geologically hazardous areas, the physical aspects of disasters, and my work slowly over time was making me see that, the phrase environmental geographers often use is that there's no natural disaster. There may be natural hazards, but disasters are human-made. And that's essentially, as I was working in this field in the first years or so, experiencing different disasters, seeing that it was really the choices that we made, the policies that we put in place, the decisions we made to not invest in certain pre-disaster mitigations that really set us up in many ways for the kind of human losses and challenges that we face post-disaster. And I think the great revealer, to borrow Secretary Dean's term, of inequality and inequity for me and probably for most Americans was Hurricane Katrina. And the images, that we saw, the tragedy that we saw of people essentially being left behind without access to transportation. I think our system in America, we're so often, it's often been said in America at least that our disaster policy, the way our disaster management system evolved, really evolved responding to primarily Atlantic hurricanes. And kind of have in mind the notion of supporting a middle-class suburban family with a car, home ownership, which is not, the kinds of events that are not all the events. They were certainly many of the events that happened that sort of led or correlated with the time in which our system evolved, but they weren't what happened in Hurricane Katrina. Only 30% of households in New Orleans actually owned cars. And that was a big shock that there were so many people. I might actually have that reversed. Let me just say, yes, 30% of people didn't have cars. But even still, that's a really big number. But that's not, and that's not going to be, it's probably higher in Vancouver, perhaps. It's not in any urban area. That's a pretty standard number, but it wasn't how we had planned for that disaster. We hadn't planned to actually help evacuate 30% of the population and provide the resources for 30% of the population with shelter and mass care during that evacuation period. And that's why we saw such, an enormous tragedy unfold, among many other conditions. But this was not new. In the 1906 earthquake was a period, was an opportunity to really, for many in the city, to eradicate the Chinese and Asian populations that people didn't want in the city. And we can probably go on and on with other examples of that. A point I'd like to really make is something that has been called the exposure continuum. And I think this is really thinking about it, the exposure to inequality and inequity in disasters. There is an exposure that happens just by damage and the initial impacts. Often we have more marginalized populations living in poor, less resilient housing to begin with, or in neighborhoods that are exposed or more exposed to industrial hazardous chemical releases and things like that as part of the disaster. Then there's the support services, like I mentioned with Katrina, in the immediate aftermath and during the event itself, like we're enduring right now with COVID. And then lastly, there's the policies for recovery and rebuilding, which, as I mentioned, often tend to be much more focused on home ownership rather than on multifamily housing residents, social housing, and people who don't actually have the means. So I'll stop there and we'll pick it up with some of the other questions.
Yes, thank you so much. So in Canada, we don't collect post-disaster data disaggregated by gender, by race, especially by race. And the Toronto study that I mentioned, apparently that's the only place as of now that related to COVID, the data is collected. And if I may just share the numbers. So Black people and other people of color make up 83% of reported COVID cases, while they only make up half of Toronto's population. And on income level, it's similar. 51% of reported cases in Toronto are people living in low-income households, while per the same thresholds, only 30% of people, city population, are considered low-income. So without having very detailed data, but there's still a lot of evidence, empirical evidence, but I think also when it comes to First Nations, there is a bit more data that both on COVID and also past disasters. Emily, could you share with us the experiences for COVID, but also the impacts from other disasters that have had disproportionate impact on First Nation communities?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Sahar. And I think I'm going to start in the space where I'm not sure what the makeup of everybody who's joining us today looks like, whether you come from the practitioner space or the academic space or consulting space, but I feel like we're likely a big mash of a collective of people who are kind of passionate about these topics. But I wanted to share and bring it from the experience of thinking about how we were walking through the initial phases of this event, and then how it's kind of transitioned all the way through acknowledging these deep spaces of both disproportionate experiences impact, but also the deep space of resilience that's actually shone through these kind of glimmering, simmering spaces that are alive and thriving in communities and on the global space when we look at how collective action came together. And I remember the day that BC dropped the provincial declaration for the state of emergency. And it was as a practitioner that was responsible for the response space at a health authority level, I remember thinking, and I think I said this to my colleague who was sitting next to me that day. I said, oh my gosh, I feel like the world is coming to an end today. We couldn't make phone calls. We couldn't connect by teleconference calls. Things were dropping. Systems were not working well that we regularly rely on for connectivity across our systems of response. And it was the first time as a practitioner in a response scenario that I'd actually experienced anything like this. I had always been in a space of response that had allowed me to intersect across my professional practice in a really fluid way. We obviously haven't had a large-scale seismic event that's pushed our systems in BC. And this was the first event that, even though it was a public health event, and you would think it wouldn't have significant impact on infrastructure, for a few days or two, it actually really crippled our ability to communicate with each other because everybody was needing that deep space of connection. And so, to make a long story short, I had this deep, the first time ever in my professional space of practice that I really felt like things were coming to this catastrophic end. And it took me a little while to kind of transition through that state of chaos and crisis in my own space of practice. But as I started to go through it, I started to see this beautiful space of collective action, acknowledgement that we were all kind of coming together, both from spaces of community, spaces of practice, across spaces of government, to really navigate and move through a common challenge and problem collectively together. And I started to really rephrase that phrase to my colleague, where I said, oh my gosh, I think the world is coming to an end. And I turned to him one day, and his name's John. I said, John, I think the world is coming to a start. I actually think we're in this beautiful space where we're actually seeing what collective action looks like together. And we're holding spaces of discussion and holding each other accountable to not accept that we can leave people behind. And at First Nations Health Authority, we work through this model called the wraparound, and it's really that feeling of being wrapped tightly in a blanket. How do we wrap around the communities that we support, and how do we wrap around ourselves as a field of practice to support each other? And I feel like through COVID, that's what I've truly been seeing, both from the space of practice, but the space of action, is that I know that there is still deep spaces of disproportionate impact. But if I think about what the field of practice would have looked like 10 years ago, I don't think we would have been having this discussion. So when I think about what my experience in having that dialogue with my colleagues around Kingcom, and I think about what that experience looked like for myself as a practitioner, to what the experience looks like now of having a transparent, open space to actually share collective action. Today is a prime example that we've actually changing the landscape of how the dialogue happens. And then as the dialogue happens, I think we see that collective action and community. And if I think about reflecting back on what Robin had to share in terms of how do we move these aspirational resources and strategies, these high-level global strategies forward, we have to create the space for communities to uphold that work and to live and breathe that work. And I think that we're very much trying to do that right now in a space of COVID response. That said, there's still kind of these limiting, grinding policies that make things deeply challenging, but having forums like this is the start, and then finding that space of collective action. And I guess to wrap this up, and I think I'm going to leave this as a bit of a cliffhanger for the other panelists if they want to jump onto this, or something that I might jump onto later. But I often think when I talk about disproportionate impacts for COVID, I have started to think about this notion of what creates community. What are these fabrics that really bring us together, that really drive how we find collective action towards resilient spaces? And how do we acknowledge that in a way that honors the unique spaces of community, the cultures, the landscapes, the economic drivers, the infrastructure drivers? And how do we honor that in a way that really captures this notion of what creates these spaces of community in this holistic and all-encompassing way? So I'll leave that as a cliffhanger for others to possibly jump on, or I might jump back to it myself a little bit later on.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. So we're all aware of the overlaps or connections between managing disaster risk and climate change adaptation issue. We have Robin with years of experience working on the climate change adaptation aspect also. Robin, could you shed some light on how much we understand, what we know, and what your own insights are or thoughts are on the disproportionate impact of climate change on different parts of the society?
Thanks. Well, I think the short answer is it's all of what we've just heard from Emily and the other panelists. You know, that climate change is and will continue to disproportionately impact those who are already marginalized either by human rights, lack of human rights, by marginal housing, by marginal and fragile incomes, by all of these things, and we're already seeing that. It's obviously, and thanks Emily for framing that both in terms of the vulnerabilities, but also the resilience, because I think that is the truth that we're seeing around climate change as well, which is that it's already and will continue to disproportionately impact Indigenous communities in Canada and around the world, in part because of where they live. So all we have to do is look to the Arctic, sort of the canary in the coal mine of our own countries grappling with climate change, in part because Indigenous peoples, not speaking for them, but have this deep connection to and with the land, and it is the land that is being impacted. Biodiversity losses, the loss of land, which we're seeing both the loss of, yes, permafrost and ice, but also the erosion of land in the Arctic, which is changing and shifting not only how and where communities can be, the traditional knowledge around patterns of species migration and where to find, what the caribou, sources of food, etc., which is no longer reliable anymore because of the significant changes, the influx of new species into the Arctic, the change in migrations pattern based on loss of ice, etc. And so there's this double hit, both in terms of food security, in terms of, again, often already marginal housing in marginal ecosystems, and this huge impact on the cultural integrity and the cultural resilience of First Nations, even as they're demonstrating and have continued to demonstrate huge resilience in the face of colonization and the enormous adverse impacts of that in every aspect of their lives. Women and children, again, in the context of climate, because they're already often more vulnerable in terms of their access to resources, access to rights, their access to sustainable incomes, also we know are already and will continue to be adversely impacted. We know climate change is going to cause enormous migration. And I think, when we look at the forced migration that is happening around the world, many of us are shocked at how bad it is. I guess the unfortunate thing is that climate change is going to make what we see today look almost minor. I think the scale of forced migration from increased resource conflicts generally, from loss of land, is going to be stunning. And again, those populations are already marginalized by being forced to migrate, often being forced to migrate by food insecurity, natural hazard related disasters and conflict. So again, this is going to impact them, those populations extensively. A lot of my work is focused with children and youth, similar to other populations, are marginalized in disasters and climate because they're often not included in the discussions and in the actual crafting of policy and responses, whether that's recovery, response, disaster risk reduction. We are making inroads in that in globally and in Canada, but communities of people who have a voice in a process are more likely to be able to shape that process in ways that support their resilience and the broader resilience of the communities. And so, climate change and climate change policies and climate change here in BC, we have the new Climate Change Adaptation strategy in the works. And I know there's been lots of consultation, and I'll just wrap it up with that to say that the bottom line is that we have to be including all communities, all populations in crafting policies that meet the unique needs of each community, geographic, human, cultural, etc. And without that, climate change and these kinds of disasters like COVID, like earthquakes, like every disaster, will continue to disproportionately affect those who are already marginalized, and in so doing, impact us all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. So I just want to go back to the participants, to the attendees, and just remind you that soon we are going to have a few minutes to ask your questions from the panelists. So please use the Q&A section. I already see a couple of questions. You can add your questions, or you can also vote for the questions that you want to be prioritized to be asked from the panelists. And going back to our panelists. So you have already touched on the various groups that are more vulnerable in the disaster situation, or in COVID, for example. And you have already also mentioned the reasons, the underlying conditions that makes them possibly more vulnerable, but also more resilient. So I think it's really important for every group we kind of touch on both aspects of possible vulnerabilities facing an event, but also the resilience that they have because of their own characteristics or the past experiences. For the case of First Nations, for example, the historical cases of the pandemics that was beginning of catastrophe for those communities, in a sense, it seems from what I've seen and heard, have given them some set of resilience for this pandemic. How about Robin, would you like to add on to what you have already started, especially on youth and children, on their conditions that makes them kind of the drivers of their vulnerability? Or do you think we can, anything to add?
Sorry, Sahar, can you clarify that question?
So basically, like, talking about the groups that are more vulnerable, one thing is to identify them, then the other aspect is to now go layers in of why are they vulnerable.
Okay, I think in part, we've all been speaking to that, but at the very opening remarks this morning, Katrina was mentioned, and I think again, I've spent in the disaster emergency management program, we use Katrina as a case study because it is such a well-researched and the event itself was so profoundly illuminating around these inequities. So the drivers, we know that probably the most important driver of inequity is unequal income, poverty. Living in poverty undermines the capacity of people to plan for and build resources resilient in the context of disasters. That goes along with housing is a huge one in disasters. Marginal housing, homelessness also increase risk. We know that violence in whatever form, whether it's violence against women, violence against children, conflict exacerbates risk in the context of disasters. It's a driver of inequity. We know that these things have been known outside of disasters. It's not for lack of knowing what drives vulnerability. Inequity, lack of access to power, lack of access to resources, lack of access to shaping what happens in ways that work in the unique context of a community or an individual family, household, etc. The silencing of various groups and their exclusion from these important conversations and actions is a huge driver of vulnerability. And then there are multiple things like access to transport that was already mentioned. The ways in which communities are shaped, the land on which it's built. I mean, we continue to build in our increasingly urban environments in Canada and around the globe. So we have highly concentrated populations living in urban environments. Many of those urban environments, including our own, including where I live, are built in areas that are highly vulnerable to various natural hazards, seismic risks, floods, etc. And we continue to build not only in locations that are highly vulnerable, which I think there's no way, in some ways, around, and we can reduce that, but every community has some of that built into it. But we continue to build in ways that undermine resilience. And so the nature of the housing, the placement of the housing, the fact that many people don't have housing. So I think those drivers are known. They're known in the social sciences, and I think in part the other driver in emergency management, and this is shifting, which is a great thing, but emergency management has, like the healthcare system, has emphasized response and reaction rather than prevention and risk reduction, and that is shifting, and it needs to shift much more, because trying to address these things in the aftermath or when they're happening increases vulnerability for everybody, but it increases definitely those pre-existing historic patterns of vulnerability. And one of the things, and finally, I would just say that, when we look at Katrina and some of the research that's emerging around COVID in relationship to previous pandemics, is that we have to look at that historical analysis. In Canada, we have to look at the role that colonization has played in marginalizing and increasing the vulnerability of Indigenous people, but also the role it's played in increasing the vulnerabilities and risks for all of society, our disconnection from nature, our disconnection from each other. And these things increase vulnerability for everybody, because we know that resilience really resides in equity and social cohesion and people working together. So I think these things are known, and we have to move, and I have to end, but we have to move from knowing them to enacting the kinds of strategies and initiatives that we know we need to enact in order to reduce them. And those will reduce them not only for disasters, but for life at large.
Very great point. In many ways, many of us, because of the social connections or lack of, we do have the social vulnerability, and in some ways, in some societies, it's increasing. Laurie, could you share your insights on kind of like the drivers of vulnerabilities, maybe from socioeconomic aspect?
Well, it's hard to not be repetitive from what Robin just said. She really covered the gamut. And Hurricane Katrina, being involved in the rebuilding process there for several years and really almost a decade, has really shown to me how inequity kind of plays out over time. And that was what I was trying to hit upon in my opening comments, is that there's an exposure continuum to a disaster, to the effects of a disaster. And, I think the Katrina situation showed not only was there just, woefully inadequate planning and understanding of the community and its needs, and how to, both in preparing, mitigating the risks they face, but also in preparing for things like hurricane evacuation. But the problems continued. The decisions that were made, I think, to follow on to Robin's point, I think it's really difficult to craft policies in the aftermath. And you have something that we've talked about called time compression, which is, a phenomenon in which a disaster itself takes out so much capital, stock, and services at once that, as planners, we were interested in the idea that what made the process of disaster recovery different. And that really is that you have to rebuild so much simultaneously. Normal land development and urban processes, unfold over decades and years. A city like Vancouver took hundreds of years to get the fabric that it has. And now you have to go in a disaster moment and sort of reconstruct that in a much more time compressed environment. And that means you have to take action and make decisions in a much more time compressed environment, which is really where it gets problematic. If you've displaced people, and typically your more marginalized people are less able to take the time to go to public meetings, they have less access to to power, as Robin was saying, and understanding of the power structures or the typical ways in which we formulate policy. That's not, if they're immigrant communities, they may not even just be exposed or aware of how we do our normal governance systems. So all of those things kind of compound in a time compressed environment. So you end up seeing problems with the kinds of policies that get enacted, which are trying to react to the problems that have been presented, because you actually don't have time to really reflect. For example, the policies that rolled out after Hurricane Katrina, one of my favorites to talk about is the policy called the Road Home, which was a policy that tried to basically fill the gap that had happened with people not having flood insurance because the levees had been certified as meeting, being able to protect people from the 100-year and the 500-year floods. But they didn't. And so a lot of people didn't have flood insurance. And so this Road Home program was a federally funded program that gave up to, I think, $150,000 to rebuild a house. But it was actually initially based on your pre-existing housing value. So if people lived in lower, smaller homes, less valued neighborhoods, then their starting point for their repair was lower than people on the other side of town who lived in larger homes, higher valued neighborhoods. But a post-disaster situation, when costs are inflated, resources are scarce, and there's a lot of competition, people weren't able to repair their house for the money they were getting back from that program. And so there was actually a big lawsuit that ensued to fix that. But that's the kinds of disparities that are just compounding the pre-existing conditions that people face, and I could go on and on with more and more of those kinds of stories, but those are the sort of, what I find, I loved what Emily said about the wraparound. I think what I was trying to say in the beginning is our disaster management system is sort of, it's not designed to look at vulnerability. It's sort of designed to kind of hit the middle, and as I mentioned, sort of like this middle-class suburban family who has good insurance, which is not everybody for lots of different reasons. People don't live in suburbia. People don't have insurance. It doesn't necessarily mean they're poor or marginalized. It just may mean they just live in a different situation. And so I think that if we designed a system, the wraparound, if we had the wraparound in mind, that what we're doing is assuming that the middle can handle themselves or can, is in a better place, but what we're really focused is the safety net, I think we'd have a very different paradigm for how we approach disaster management and particularly our recovery policies.
So to continue with this flow, and I will get back to hear from Emily on the underlying drivers, but to continue with the flow that you are going, Laurie, on recovery planning. You have extensive experience in recovery planning. Could you share with us a bit more insight on opportunities in recovery planning to incorporate the voice of all parts of society?
Yeah, well, that's, I'll go to Katrina again, just because I think that was such a challenging moment to be doing a recovery planning process where only, I think at the time we started this process, a little more than 50% of the population had come back. So we had to design a process in which we engaged people all over the country, tried to find where they had been displaced to, and people had been displaced to every state in the country. We had people displaced at Alaska to Hawaii because of the way the federal system kind of kicked in and took people, particularly who had lived in public housing, and matched them up with available public housing units in different parts of the country. And so we actually designed a process that was three-tiered. We had planners working at a neighborhood level, then working at what we call the district level, which was really intentionally designed to integrate together different neighborhoods that otherwise wouldn't have talked. And New Orleans historically has streets that really separate communities ethnically, economically, et cetera. And we wanted to kind of cross those and engage all of those issues together, because in repairing streets and roads and everything, you don't necessarily look at it in those disparate ways. I mean, we have to bring all of those communities together. So we had the district level, and then we had the community-wide level, which we had what we called community congresses, where we actually had, we engaged people. I knew something like that would happen. Sorry about that. Engaged people all over the country. We had 5 simulcast locations of people, with thousands of people participating in the process. We also reached out to libraries across America, made the briefing book in advance, got community organizers in different parts of the country to go to churches and places where people would be willing to listen to us and engage with us and get them to participate in the process. So it was the money that was spent on the community organizing and the communications for the planning process was more than what was spent on the actual plan, you know, what you could sort of consider the typical planner part of the process itself. It was a huge endeavor, and that's you know, and there are many people who would be incredibly critical of what we did, but I can tell you, like, we did the best we could in that moment, in that short period of time, trying to reach as many people as possible. And I think what really resonated for me at that moment was the sort of sense of home that people have, and that displacement, you know, to go to Robin's point, what we're going to be looking at with forced migration in the future, you know, the displacement, when you untouch somebody from their community, when you untouch them from the social cohesion, the social capital that they had before that disaster, then you're really setting people up for tremendous challenge in being able to recover. And even today, 80% of New Orleans population numbers are back to their pre-Katrina conditions, but that is not 80% of the pre-Katrina residents. There are people who are never coming back, and there are new people who move to New Orleans, and that's natural for communities. You know, we see that sort of stuff, but it was such a forced and dramatic impact that people, you know, have really will suffer forever for the impact of that particular disaster on their families and their lives.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. Emily, would you like to share some insights on the characteristics, the drivers of, in a sense, vulnerability as well as resilience of First Nation communities when they're faced with disasters?
For sure, and I think this springboards really nicely off of what Laurie and Robin have been highlighting. And I'm going to share an experience from the 2017 wildfires in BC, because I think it really poignantly addresses what disproportionate impact from disasters looks like in a really concrete way. When the 2017 fires moved through British Columbia, it was the largest fire season that the province had ever experienced. And by the end of that fire season, what we saw statistically was that as the fires burned, they impacted almost as many local government settings as they did First Nation settings. I can't remember the statistics right off the back of my head, but it was almost an even number of local governments and regional districts in the province that had been impacted as First Nation communities. But what we saw was a really significant disproportionate experience from communities and individuals that needed support from the impacts of the event. We saw it from the space of evacuation, when homes were evacuated and communities were evacuated. What we saw was that for many in the local government setting, there was a space of privilege with regards to accessibility to homeowners insurance, which really allowed that transitional space of being out of the home in a space of security tied to insurance policies. So people were put up in hotels and were able to move through, although a very traumatic situation still, they were able to move through with spaces of support. On the flip side, for many people living on reserve, it's very hard to access homeowners insurance for a whole host of reasons. It's both cost prohibitive, but it's also very challenging due to what homeownership looks like on reserve and that space of accessibility there. And so what we saw was that when we looked at in the media, really even amplified, I think, what this looks like. What we saw at reception centers across the province, spaces for group lodging, was that there was a really high and disproportionate rate of Indigenous people really needing those supports and services, simply because they didn't have the accessibility to their internal supports and services through different measures and mechanisms of insurance. And so not only were they moving through this very traumatic experience, and everybody in BC was collectively as a whole, but that experience was magnified by needing to go through further kind of hurdles and challenges of accessing services that were at times very confusing and challenging to access, and unfortunately at the time really not grounded in a deep space of cultural safety and humility. So really looking at the impacts of what group lodging looks like for Indigenous people who had perhaps lived through the space of residential schools and being kind of, you know, spoken to by number, required to stand in a line, having to wait for food, having to stay in group lodging that didn't really uphold the space of family, the connection to community, and all of these things that really brought back these deeply traumatic experiences. And in a way, you know, I think that there was this urgent need to meet the immediate needs that people had. But in hindsight, it's now recognizing that even in meeting those immediate needs for food, clothing, and shelter, it still causes deep spaces of harm and further spaces of trauma. And I raise my hands actually to the work of EMBC in this space and the ESS team, because they put incredible thought and consideration into how they move through and enhance these pieces of work, but there's still such a far way to go when ultimately we know that it's not just the services that need supporting, it's these foundational mechanisms and these legislated spaces of oppression really in society that are manifesting what vulnerability looks like. All the services in the world can be culturally safe and you can create that wraparound effect, but if we're constantly having to do it in disproportionate ways, it's not actually lessening these spaces of risk at the community level. I think we need to recognize that even though, you know, services and supports need to be provided in a culturally safe way, what we need to do is really dismantle the systems that create these risks and vulnerabilities. And when I look at the role of the Indian Act in terms of its role even in exacerbating disaster risk, I don't think we've even dismantled that as a field of practice or a space of governance from the federal down to the local levels. I think we have this blanket acceptance that it's a space of legislation that governs First Nation and Indigenous communities across Canada. But recently I was at a forum that was thinking about how do we create a more inclusive approach to the Emergency Program Act. And there was a beautiful dialogue on how we do that and how we create that. But I remember thinking, if we don't actually look at the other overarching pieces of legislation that are accessing vulnerability, how do we look at these other spaces of legislation that are trying to create resilience? They're almost working in these polarizing spaces against each other. And so I think it's how do we harmonize all of these spaces that create these legislated makeups of community and actually create interconnected, tightly woven spaces of legislation that actually truly speak about resilience holistically to really help guide what our work is looking at in emergency management and response. And I know that's a bigger challenge than being able to dismantle the pieces of disaster legislation, but I think it's a critical piece to have a more meaningful dialogue. So yeah, thank you for that.
Merci, thank you. Very important point. So we are at the QA phase, and I see a few questions. I don't see much voting, but I'll start from one question that was repeated, and that's basically how do we foster, this is to all the panelists, so each of you please, you can all react. How can we better foster more connections between professions and professionals, research and academic work in disaster or emergency management, and connecting them with the communities and the needs of policies for building community resilience? So the connection between the science and policy, how can that be done better and what can enable it? Anybody would like to go first? Laurie, I saw you unmuting.
I'll say a few things just to get it going. I think I've been very pleased to see leadership from our National Science Foundation in the United States in interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary research and really making that now structured conditions of research programs. So many of you who might go to the Natural Hazards Conference in the United States each year, the Natural Hazards Center now also serves as something called, they do something called Converge, which is really a role that the National Science Foundation created that said all of these different sort of focused disciplinary groups that are researching disasters, they call it extreme event reconnaissance groups, but there's one in the geotechnical space, another in the structural engineering space, another in the social science space. And Converge is actually forcing all of them to work better together. And I think that that's just a really important step forward. I personally would like to see more interaction between the professions that are really evolving to address the issues of climate change with some of what I would call the more traditional hazard communities, and making sure that we really transfer the lessons and even the policy mechanisms that we have in place to deal with landslides, fault rupture. There are ways we can adapt these policies to work for sea level rise and for other challenges that we're going to be facing, wildfire zones, so there's a lot of knowledge that needs to be transferred and connected, I think, as we face the challenges of the future. And I'll stop there. I had another point, but maybe I'll remember it later.
Thank you. Robin, what are your
thanks. I just wanted to follow up on a couple of things that Laurie said and add a few. One, so I'll start with that last point around this intersection or sometimes lack thereof between the climate adaptation, the climate action community as a whole, and the disaster and emergency management community. And again, I think it's shifting. I've seen a shift in the last 10 years, but we have a long way to go. I often see or hear about thinking and work being done on the climate side that is not drawing on the decades of work and research on the disaster emergency management, disaster risk reduction side. So I think, again, on really with both arenas, our over-reliance on or exclusion of learning from the global south, often who have experienced more disasters and who, by the very nature of their, in lower income countries, innovation and creative response to these things is not a choice, it's a necessity. There aren't the resources that we have the privilege and the privilege that we have here in the global north. And so we don't draw a lot on that research, and a lot of that work is being done, has embraced disaster risk reduction much sooner than we have in the global north, with some very creative solutions around engagement and participatory actions. And I think there's an attitude that somehow we don't need that, or it's not as much of a necessity in our own environments, which I think is really problematic. I think the trans and interdisciplinary research is really important. I think somehow we have to be pushing for that in our governments. Our government departments are still very siloed. Somebody, I think Emily, you talked or somebody did about EMBC and the work that has been done around integrating, vulnerability into the lens and analysis of what's happening in disasters. And I think that's great. And I know that there's some conversations happening between the Climate Adaptation Secretariat and the Climate Change Secretariat and the disaster EMBC and other folks in disaster emergency management. I think we need to amplify that. But I also think that we need to find ways of bringing these very siloed departments into greater collaboration and cooperation within government, because we've seen that with COVID. The necessity of that is very apparent. You can't look at this as only health. You have to look at economy, and you have to look at the environment, and we need to be working with that. And I think meaningful engagement. I think somehow the Natural Hazards Forum in the States, the Canadian Risk and Hazards Network here are trying to bridge those gaps between practitioners and scholars. I think we need to make greater effort to include policymakers. I think we need in on our side to, as researchers, as practitioners, to understand how policy is created. I think on the government side, to include in meaningful ways these various populations in crafting policy. And I think more of that is happening, but in my experience, it's often, there's always a time crunch, whether it's the time crunch of recovery or the time crunch of policy development, et cetera. And so these conversations happen, but they happen often in a slightly superficial way, as opposed to deeply engaging people and communities in starting to craft these policies and to craft and to work with the research. So the final point I would make on that is that as researchers producing this information, we have to continue to push ourselves to make what we have learned from previous disasters and from research in other fields around social inequity and vulnerability, around culture, etc. We have to push to make this more accessible. And I think the very nature, as much as we can, the academic systems that are in place work against that. Often, we talk about mobilizing knowledge, but, academics are not given credit for mobilizing knowledge except in, peer-reviewed journals. And that's really important because that peer review is important. But it also means that a lot of what is produced is inaccessible and unavailable to people who are not interested in reading long papers with lots of big words and hyphenated titles and, etc. And also it makes it inaccessible because so much of what we do is in a written form. And I think, as valuable as that is, we have to work to translate this into other ways, literally other languages, in terms of, how we normally understand languages, but also other languages of communication, visual and otherwise, so that the information that we have, the evidence that we have is more accessible and more available to people who are engaged in these processes, whether they're in government or in communities.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Emily, I saw you raising your hand. We are kind of getting tight. Actually, we are over time and I have to make up time somewhere. Would you like to quickly react to this point?
No, I can hold it for later for sure.
Okay. Thank you so much. We come back to the next round of Q&A and we still have questions. But I do encourage the participants to please add your questions to the QA box or vote for the existing questions. So we haven't been hearing much from Jackie. She's doing fascinating work, fascinating research at NRCan. We are now going to hear about the research she's doing in modeling the characteristics of the communities and the insights being used for recovery planning. Jackie, could you please start sharing your screen and unmute yourself?
Well, thank you so much, Sahar, and thank you for having me in this incredible session. I've learned so much from other panelists already, and I'm joining everyone today from the traditional and unceded territory of the Coast Salish people. And having heard from all of this, all the other panelists in the session so far, we really realized that the social vulnerability of a place is highly complex, and to understand it, it often requires the local and qualitative research to really start to unpeel the onion or the layers to understand the complexity. However, when we expand our studies to a regional or a larger city, we start to see that indicator-based approaches are much more popular because it allows us to quantify the vulnerability and measure it and allow easier comparison across places to help, say, prioritizing the efforts and planning. So today the presentation is really to give us a quick overview of 3 indicator-based approaches that my colleague Marie-Janae and I have been working on. Having said that, all 3 of these approaches are by no means intended to replace these local and detailed in-depth studies of social vulnerability. So The three approaches that we are looking at, the first one is probably one of the most popular approaches called Social Vulnerability Index that measures the overall level of social vulnerability of a place. The second approach is the capacity threshold scores, which start to unpack the different aspects of social vulnerability by measuring the level of vulnerability in terms of 4 major themes. And the last approach no longer try to measure the level of social vulnerability, but start to unpack the context in which a place can be socially vulnerable. So starting with the first one, but also called often the SOVI index, is really trying to address the question of where are the most or the least vulnerable places, which is really based on the model that Cutter and colleagues has developed with the hazards of place model, which is a composite index that is based on a wide range of demographic indicators. So here we have implemented it across Canada, and the map on the right-hand side is showing the index across Metro Vancouver, where we start to see pockets of higher social vulnerability. The second approach is the capacity threshold scores, where we really want to try to understand, maybe identify areas where vulnerability converge in terms of specific aspects of vulnerability. So the 4 aspects that we try to represent here includes the financial agency, which is based on indicators related to the financial means to take action to respond after a disaster. Sorry for the garbage truck you might hear in the background. But the second theme is the housing conditions, which is related to the tendency, suitability, and affordability of housing. And the individual autonomy is really speaking to the individual ability to understand the situation after a disaster and respond and take action. The last one, the family structure, is related more to indicators around living conditions and dependent relationships. So the scores here are really based on a number of indicators under each theme. So for example, a neighborhood might score, say, 4 out of 6, which means that the neighborhood has values in 4 out of the 6 indicators that is higher than a specific threshold. So this methodology was really adopted from a community vulnerability score that was also implemented by the Bay Area's Resilience Program. And then the third approach, the neighborhood vulnerability profiles, we're starting to dig deeper to try to address the question of what are the possible drivers of vulnerability in different neighborhoods. So implementing this across neighborhoods in BC, we have identified 8 predominant profiles of social vulnerability. And these profiles are based on 12 indicators reflecting the same 4 themes that I talked about in the previous approach. So this was implemented across BC, and the map on the right-hand side is really showing the different neighborhoods in Metro Vancouver and mapping them to the 8 different profiles. I won't go through all the profiles, but it ranges from, say, the light yellow color neighborhoods are neighborhoods that tends to have higher concentration of elderly population and lower income households, to more complex profiles such as the neighborhoods in red that tends to have higher concentration of population with low education attainment that might not be fluent in English or French, visible minority population, as well as households living in overcrowded housing. So we can quickly see just in this map that even within one community, neighborhoods can be vulnerable in very different ways. So to use these approaches in the context of disaster risk planning, one obvious way is to compare the modeled impact from a given disaster. Say, for example, here we're looking at the left-hand side is a map of the estimated displaced population for more than 3 months in a given seismic scenario. And then the right-hand side, we have the map of the vulnerability profiles. So by, for example, if we look at this hotspot of displacement, which coincides with neighborhood profiles of this light teal color, maybe this neighborhood with displaced population might require additional support in terms of translating, helping them understand the information, how to access temporary housing or additional resources for recovery, given that maybe this neighborhood has a higher concentration of population that is not fluent in English or French. However, you can also go and look at this hotspot here, for example. This coincides with neighborhood with the profile of an area that might have a higher concentration of households that live in unaffordable housing or rental housing. These households might also have lower income. So this neighborhood might require additional support in terms of government-provided temporary housing rather than using their own income to find a hotel as a temporary shelter. So another application that we are looking at, which is one of our key next steps in the project, is starting to take a more bottom-up approach to meet these top-down approaches using these indicators, is to start working with some of the neighborhood organizations in the city of Vancouver, hopefully one from each of the vulnerability profiles, to start to understand at a given neighborhood of a certain profile, what kind of services do they need? What are the services that are critical that is making up this neighborhood? And then try to develop with them what are the targeted restoration goals? How quickly must those services be brought back in order to keep these people within this neighborhood? So for example, we want to say if this is the normal level of service for a given service that they need, after a disaster, the loss of that service, what is the target rate of restoration that would best support the neighborhood in recovery? Comparing that to our modeled rate of restoration, we start to get a sense of what the service resilience gap can look like. So it's quite helpful to start to see what this gap looks like, given that it can help us translate that gap into restoration goals to utility companies or local services. But it also helps a neighborhood start thinking about what kind of actions they can take within the neighborhood to deal with this gap in which we don't have that given service. So, so having said this, I think there's lots to talk about, and I look forward to all the feedback from everyone. And I'll pass this back to Sahar.
Wonderful. Fascinating work. Thank you so much, Jackie. We will have the Q&A upcoming in few minutes after hearing from two others. And so audience, please feel free to put your questions specifically for Jackie's work in the Q&A box. So shifting gear to look into the future, to look into the more hopeful, having a vision and suggestions of what can we do, what can be done for building resilience in advance, before a disaster, and also during recovery to enhance the equity and equality in the society and reduce this disproportionate impact. Laurie, we already heard, you already started touching on opportunities in recovery and some of the examples you gave. Could you shed a bit more light on the opportunities we have? Maybe still touch on the challenges, the very interesting point you were saying that the mechanisms not being in place to talk to these different groups, to give voice to these different groups, and all of a sudden post-disaster in a far more rushed situation, it's very difficult to make that happen. Can you give us a bit more insight on opportunities also in recovery plan?
Well, I think what Jackie just illustrated is just, to kind of put a little context onto how I read it, I think it's just fantastic because it shows sort of an evolution too in our thinking about these issues. You know, the Social Vulnerability Index to me was, you know, when it first came out, it was just fantastic that, you know, that we were finally trying to kind of figure out where we had these areas of concern. But it also, you know, I think it really illuminated for me right away as a woman, you know, a girl who grew up in a very rural area of Texas, a ranching farming community. You know, it was on that national SOVI map was like listed as high vulnerability. And I just I was bemused by it because it just was so not realistic for where I grew up. I mean, when we had an accident, people got together, you know, that sort of idea of barn building as a community, we did that, you know? So I was like, we're not socially vulnerable. We might not be as rich as other places, but there's something, and I think that really illustrated for me what Jackie's showing in the second set of work, which is that resilience is not the inverse of vulnerability. Resilience is something so much more. And it has social cohesion, there's social capital, there's the interconnectedness of things working together that Emily was talking about. And I think we're really only on the cusp of understanding that. And I really like what Jackie was illustrating for us is that you know, there are ways now we can develop indicators that can inform us as to what the service impacts, you know, those resilience needs are, and tailor the programs for those different communities based on those kinds of analyses. So I see a tool like that as really the starting point. But what has to come after that is engagement. And I think that goes back to the point I wasn't able to make earlier about sort of what's missing in terms of the multidisciplinary research and knowledge transfer, is just really that when it comes to research or planning processes or anything like that, we don't invest in longitudinal studies. So we often don't really see what the real outcomes are, you know. So if you have a research grant, it's typically 2 years and you can maybe stretch it to 4. So most of my work has actually been done by pasting together consulting relationships and for my longtime research colleague, Rob, you know, being able to take a sabbatical, you know, in the country we were trying to study, working with PhD students, you know, over several generations of students to do our longitudinal work. That's, you know, that's very hard for other researchers. You know, we've kind of cobbled this together in a kind of crazy way, and is not normal, and perhaps even frowned upon by some institutions. And I think the same is true when it comes to engaging with the community. What Jackie just showed us is this incredible opportunity, but now we've got to invest in a program that goes out there and engages with people and continues to engage with people, because communities are not static. Jackie's image right now is gonna change, you know, so we have to constantly stay in engagement and be dynamic in our policies and our responses. And I think that just doesn't match bureaucracy very well. And that's where really the NGO community is so essential to sort of, to me, it's the, you know, we call it the third sector. It really needs to be a much more integrated third sector in terms of how we approach disaster management, both in terms of preparedness and in resilience building in communities, as well as in response and recovery.
Wonderful, great point. Indeed, Jackie's presentation was a great transition. Also in response to the question that we were discussing before, the connection between science and policy and use of research and data.
So all of that takes money. I just forgot to say, like, that is not like, these are not politicians' time frames. These are not budget time frames. These have to extend over time, both on the research side and on the community engagement and policymaking side. We have to look at this as intergenerational in terms of council elections or budgets. You know, that's the only way we're going to make some progress.
But maybe also some norms of the practice, right? Like if it becomes acceptable and expected to have these consultations, then the programs will be budgeted to incorporate the fees that are needed for that consultations. Robin, on that change of gear, on the positive side, on recommendations, on vision, on opportunities, Can you tell us more about the opportunities? Still, there's space if you want to touch on challenges for climate change adaptation, for using that process for enhancing equity in the society.
Yeah, well, I think what I have to say echoes what has already been said. And I think what it's pointing to, I increasingly believe that one of the huge opportunities in COVID, and it's an opportunity that we are already rushing past. That is one of the challenges: the speed of recovery and the intensity of the desire to return to something that looks like what we're familiar with. But anyway, the opportunity here is to really look at all these intersections: the Black Lives Matter, all the research that's happening with COVID, the fact that we've been able to change as quickly as we have. In response to the threat initially, equally the speed at which we are trying to forget that and move on to something that resembles what we had before. So I think there's one of the opportunities in the space of the current recovery, if we're framing it around COVID, for climate change, is to really look at what we need to be doing across systems. And it is a broad systemic change. I mean, one of my early slides was around capitalism. And listen, I I'm part of it. I live it. I can't imagine what the other system is, but that fundamentally, and it's been said in the Black Lives Matter campaign, it's been said over and over, is that fundamentally the systems that we are operating in are working exactly as they are meant to operate, which is fundamentally and inescapably based on inequity. So we have to start taking a look at those systems and really thinking how we make those fundamental changes. I think in the immediate, in any disaster, there's a balancing between the immediate needs and meeting those needs in whatever ways we have the capacity to do that. So I'm not suggesting that that should shift, but there has to also be paralleling that, I believe anyway, some way of slowing it down to be able to really understand, and while still meeting those needs, to have some group, some entities that are able to really look at what is being exposed and start slowing it down and saying, how do we want to use this huge influx of resources, money, time, focus and attention of the media, etc., in ways that will make these profound changes in systems that will start to reduce the inequities. And I think we've seen some of that with COVID. Certainly here we saw, in part as a public health measure, all of a sudden we started using hotels to provide homes for those who needed shelter and who were living with homelessness. So I think, if we can sort of move away from this, this kind of siloed thinking that is characteristic of dominant culture, into this more intersectional thinking, whether it's around vulnerability and risk, whether it's around the strategies that we do. And we have, I think, an opportunity right now that will have huge implications for climate to really look at how we are framing our relationship to nature. And even saying that is it sort of sets us outside of nature. And we know, for example, that the pandemic, zoonotic viruses such as the coronavirus, are going to increase in the context of climate change. So we're facing a pandemic right now, but it doesn't mean that we're not going to face another one. And so, and some of the issues that are connected to that, globalization, this over-reliance on global supply chains, the disconnection from nature that is characteristic of dominant culture orientation to nature. And again, the opportunity is not the only one, but I think there's a huge opportunity to meaningfully engage with, amongst others, Indigenous people, and understand and learn from the wisdom that they have and from the different cultural orientation that is there to the environment. We know that these systems are inexorably, intertwined. We can't separate ourselves from the environment in which we live. And we've spent a long time doing that, really. And so I think there's an opportunity right now in this moment in time, in this moment in history, to really learn about that and learn from it. And I guess I'll try and finish on a positive note after I've said this, which is, I think we in policy, in practice, as citizens, etc., really need to push against this fundamental and quite understandable desire to return to what we had and become and support with our systems, our policies, our educational system, and I work in the educational system, start building that kind of adaptive mindset that has a greater capacity for holding uncertainty, has a greater willingness to look at change and be with change and be intentional with change, so that we're not constantly returning back to, even when we talk about building back better, we're still building back often what we had, and we know it's not working. And we've had multiple indications that it's not working. And that is, I think, the key opportunity is to really say, how do we start with our systems to build that intentionality around being adaptive, being flexible, and being connected to other systems. And I think we can do it. I think we've seen that we can do it, but we need to be conscious and be intentional and mindful about it, even as we're struggling with the immediate and short-term impacts of whatever the disaster is.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, for those insights. So we are getting close to the end. We do have some time for QA, and we'll go for the last round of hearing from our panelists. So building on a point that Robin, you made, there is a question for Emily in terms of the government's approach in emergency management and the current work that is going on for COVID response, but also past work. How much emphasis is given on local knowledge and processes? How much do they allow gathering and benefiting from the insight and knowledge of First Nation community?
Yeah, I think in a forum like this, there's obviously a space where we hold a deep space for Indigenous knowledge and knowledge at the local level. I think it's translating that, though, into holding that knowledge in a high regard across all of the spaces of systems. And as Robin and Laurie and Jackie were speaking, I was thinking, we're all collectively talking about system changes here and how we create these models for resilience. And I think one of the things that's become really poignant for me through COVID is that it's created a fundamental shift in every community that we support, whether it's a local government or First Nations community in this space of emergency management. And I think this has been it's been such a paramount and fundamental shift, and yet we have not supported communities with the capacity that they need to shift through this deeply challenging time. We're assuming that with different resources that communities will be able to shift and transition in a resilient way through this catastrophic shift that's impacted our communities. And yet we haven't really, as a space of government, there hasn't been a shift in funding and capacity to support for communities to uphold systems to actually make these shifts in a meaningful way. And I think so often, and I don't want to speak for folks on this panel or for others, but so often when we think about these shifts, we think about them at a very high level or a very theoretical level from the higher levels of government down. But I think, how do we flip that on an inverse way and really give meaningful funding support and drive that capacity at the community level? Because communities inherently know how to support and how to drive resilience in the best way that works for them. I know, Sahar, one thing that we talked about when we chatted was that there's this beautiful quote that says, to be Indigenous is to be resilient. And through generations and generations of oppression and colonization, there's this beautiful space of resilience that shines through at the community level, even in the darkest moments and in these really kind of disparaging times when disasters happen. There's always this beautiful and deep space of kind of reciprocity, resilience, and the ability to collectively come together and to share that deep space of culture, that deep space of wellness. And it's gritty, but it really does shine through. And I think that's where the capacity needs to be driven, and that's where we need to nurture these spaces. And when I think about what it takes, Robin's so right. We're still working in these very siloed spaces where we see infrastructure, we see the built environment, the natural environment, the wellness landscape, the cultural landscape. But what we really need to do is understand where those spaces intersect and how they come together to create that fabric of resilience. And we haven't actually empowered or created accountability within that space, because in many ways, nobody holds that responsibility to actually do that. And I think that starts at the local level. How do we fund chief resilience officers or resilience coordinators or leads at a local level and at a regional level that can tie all of the beauty and the fabric that makes our communities whole together? And how do we create a governance for that all the way through? I look at what the Rockefeller Foundation has done and what the City of Vancouver's done through its resilience building mechanisms and methods, and it's so deeply powerful and inspiring, and yet it's just one tiny glimmer of hope. And so how do we take those kind of hopeful and integrated spaces, but give them the leverage and capacity that they need? And I think that COVID is this shining example of a time to do that. In many ways, right now, there is no financial or legislated mechanism to truly support communities through COVID recovery. It just actually isn't in the provincial mechanisms to kind of support communities through these spaces. And I think that we'll get there and we'll drive kind of that model for what recovery and resilience looks like. But it doesn't look like a normal model for post-disaster recovery, because we won't be post-COVID for such a very long time. So I think it's, how do we create these transitional spaces of resilience, and how do we do that in the highest way that gives local governments, local authorities, regional districts, First Nation communities the capacity to be able to drive that themselves in a way that works for their communities. And so, I don't know, I would offer that as kind of a hopeful place to look at this intersectional approach.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This was great. And it's, in some ways, you kind of touched on few questions that we're asking about how can we improve the governance system from not only at the local level, because it seems like we do have a bit better understanding of the demands and needs and opportunities at the local level, but how all the way to the federal government, this was one of the questions, we can better engage to make sure the resources, legislations are in place to have that engagement. There's also a couple of questions, Laurie, for you on the Hurricane Katrina experience and the things that didn't work well, and or like suggestions or ideas of how things could be different. But we are running out of time, and I want to like shift and link the QA basically to closing remarks from each of the panelists. In a sense, Emily, I feel like you did great. Like you did these last points with inspirational and good thoughts and ideas that we can all take home. So I would like to just go to the other panelists to hear your last points of recommendations or what you want our audience to take home from today's event. Laurie, please go ahead.
Me, okay. Well, so much has been said, and we have very few minutes, so I don't want to repeat things. I think just in terms of thinking about COVID, some comments have been made that I've been thinking about this as well. As a person who specialized in long-term recovery, the point that Emily just made, that there, and I saw several comments in there about what is COVID recovery. We're going to be in this for a while, and it really is it's a perplexing, it's a kind of overwhelming, even for somebody like me who's spent my life focusing on how you help communities recover. I think the things I would say is that I think this is different in terms of that we are still in the midst of the event. And unlike so many disasters, you sort of show up at the scene, and the disaster has happened. We have an opportunity to control the impacts of this disaster. And to me, that has been the missed opportunity that our governments, and maybe Canada did better than mine, but I think we really didn't. We missed an opportunity to really cushion the blow for people and to sustain them through the impacts. And I think that there's a lot of lessons for us to draw from that in thinking about other disasters, because even events like wildfires, we can control the impacts during the event itself. It's not all about sort of the engineering resilience, that we have to do all this investment ahead of time and that'll soften the blow. We can actually soften the blow in the midst of the event. It's much harder for earthquakes, but I think if we think hard about it, we can do more there too. And certainly earthquake early warning and other things are ways in which we can do more to sort of soften the impacts while we're in the midst of the event itself. And so that's one issue that I've really taken to heart. The other point I just want to say in closing is that, to go with Robin's point about change, I think we really do have to build, really begin to think about how we educate our younger generations around accepting adaptation and uncertainty and change, because it will be, change will be accelerating. And I really can't tell you what life is going to be like post-COVID, because we are still in the midst of the impacts, and we still have not seen, the devastation that the economic impacts and social impacts are really going to have. We're sort of still on life support right now. And unless there's a dramatic shift in policy, we will have, massive blight, dislocation, the kinds of really severe problems that we have after catastrophic events. But it's going to come over, the next year to 2 years. But it's really going to transform our communities, and maybe for the best, but, maybe not. We have to start thinking about that. So those are some thoughts that I wanted to share in closing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Laurie. Jackie, can we hear from you your couple of closing remarks?
Yeah, I'll be very quick since we're getting over time. But I want to build on Emily's point about communities already often know best of what is best for them in terms of how to build resilience. So I really hope to see that in terms of research as well as local government providing more support to neighborhood organizations who already have a lot of knowledge about the challenges that the community is facing and have already built trusting relationships with residents. So I hope that we can see more of that going forward. And another point that I'd like to make is speaking to Robin's point about bringing everyone to the table in understanding how to structure policies and systems to reduce vulnerability. Often we see children and elderly as the vulnerable people, and see them as passive recipients of support and contributions. But we don't often try to understand how they contribute to the response and recovery process. So I feel like as researcher, I'd like to see more of that happening. I think it will really be beneficial to not just the COVID recovery, but also a multi-hazard approach in risk reduction.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Robin, leaving it in your hands to close it off.
Well, yes, and it's a reiteration, but I think at work I can make, sort of 4 points. One is, I think, meaningful engagement and education. We have to be doing a better job on both fronts and shaping engagement, not just as consultation, but deep and meaningful engagement with these with all populations. Shaping our education in ways that make it more accessible and that focus on some of the issues that we've been talking about, and insist that that becomes part of not just K-12, but also, any kind of university education, or any informal education, providing those opportunities to learn about these things and build, enhance, and increase the capacity of individuals and communities to enact these changes. I think another one is absolutely applying a gender and an intersectional analysis and insisting that our governments do that across all initiatives and all policies, so that it is not just an add-on, but that it is an integral part of what we do and how we think. I think applying similarly a green and just lens to this huge efforts going on right now around fiscal recovery. We have to insist on those, you know, I was at another webinar and a young person said, well, let's move away from shovel ready to shovel worthy. And I think that's what we need to do, is we need shovel worthy, whether we're using a shovel metaphorically or otherwise, so that we're incorporating just actions and green actions into every way that we spend the money that we're spending on recovery. And finally, let's not miss this opportunity. We've had so many of them to learn and change our practices, and they change incrementally. This is an opportunity, and an extended one, for us to really change what we're doing and not miss the opportunity to learn and move forward to create the kind of world that we all want to live in.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We are at the end of the event. We are even a few minutes over time. We still have the participants. I cannot figure out how to unmute. Daryl, if you can, please go ahead. I want to thank our panelists in your busy schedule. Thank you so much to make the time to join the event. Thank you for your insights, your energy. I felt like even though I've talked to every one of you, I still learned today, and I feel inspired and had a lot of like points and awe moments in my head. Thank the audience for your patience. It's a bit difficult, I know, not to see each other, not to have the energy, but I also want to thank our sponsors, which if I manage to share my screen so that I remember. Thank our sponsors, our host and and all the other sponsors. Also a reminder, we have our next event a week from now on macroeconomic impacts of disasters. We have great speakers for that session too. Hope to see you there. And then we'll have our URBC 2020, the main part, starting in September. Thank you so much for your time and have a great day. I wish we could have a clap. Thank you.
Thank you, Sahar.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sahar.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.